Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Rev.Nicole Caldwell-Gross, and I have the incredible privilege of serving as the pastor of outreach at St. Luke's United Methodist Church here in Indianapolis. We gather here today to celebrate the life and the legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose dream transformed our cities, our country, and our world. While we acknowledge that his dream for political equality, for racial justice, and for economic access was one that impacted each of us, we also recognize that his dream has yet to be fully realized. That's why, out of our commitment to be a justice-seeking church and to actively work to dismantle racism, we have convened the first annual Dream Keepers panel. And we've invited local thought leaders whose work in the political, educational, economic, and community development sectors is keeping the dream of Martin Luther King Jr. alive today. As they share their wisdom, you will hear practical strategies that you can replicate in your own community or congregations, or that you can join to be a dream keeper too. So let's meet our esteemed panelists. I begin with our first dream keeper, who is the Reverend Dr. David Hampton. Dr. Hampton is the founder and the CEO of his newly launched firm, Hampton Innovations. He provides strategic consulting for individuals, churches, nonprofits, businesses, and government agencies on how to thrive through change, especially the change we're all experiencing in the midst of COVID-19. Dr. Hampton has over 20 years of experience as a pastor and faith leader, and served most recently as the deputy mayor of neighborhood engagement from 2016 to 2020 right here in the city of Indianapolis. Our next dream keeper is Tosseia Holmes. Tosseia is the executive director of Crooked Creek Community Development Corporation Northwest, as well as, congratulations are in order, for the newly appointed chief financial officer of our well-known Indianapolis nonprofit Second Helpings. Her long career in community development and business consulting can be traced to the United Way, where she led a project of funding that exceeded $1 million for the first time within that organization. And she also formerly served as the executive director of finance and administration for Eastern Star Church, where she worked alongside a team of executives that launched the Rock Initiative, a $25 million community development project that has transformed the community and the church. Our final dream keeper is Derrin Slack. Derrin is the founder and CPO of ProAct Indy. You can see it on his t-shirt, and an award-winning community leader with a strong background in nonprofit management, research, training, and leadership. He acts as the conduit between the needs of the community and the individuals, partners, sponsors, and students that engage with ProAct. Under his leadership, the organization has engaged over 25,000, not 25, not 2,500, 25,000 boys and girls, community leaders, and business professionals to value intentional community engagement and appreciate diversity and equity as an integral part of their lives. We also anticipated having our fourth dream keeper, the Reverend Anthony Murdock, join us today, but we can all relate as pastors and faith leaders and nonprofit leaders to pastoral emergencies. They come up. And so while we miss him, we are grateful for those dream keepers who will share their wisdom and experience as we think about how we too can become dream keepers. With all of that said, I want to start our conversation by saying thank you. You all are an incredibly impressive and busy group of dream keepers. And so taking time to share with us, our congregation and our community, out of your experience is something that we are incredibly grateful for. Now, to kick off our conversation, I want to start with the person whose life, legacy, and example calls us here today. And I want to hear from each of you about something about Martin Luther King's dream, his work, his experiences that inspires you and how that translates into your work today. Let's start with Dr. Hampton.
Thank you, Nicole. And again, thank you for having me. And it's an honor to join this great panel with both Derrin and Tosseia. So thank you again. I had the great fortune of speaking the other day at our city's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. annual program. And one of the things that I mentioned, and I want to just kind of repeat that, is I really appreciate that Dr. King carried really a concurrent message of not just ethics, but also economics. And you mentioned that in the beginning, but he was very radical economically. And as Dr. Cornel West says, we have to do Dr. King's legacy honor by sharing the unsanitized version of Dr. King. Oftentimes you hear this non-threatening, often whitewashed, perspective of Dr. King, when the reality is he was considered a radical. He would still be considered such today. He would be considered a socialist, Black Lives Matter sympathizer today. And we still battle the same types. And if January 6th did not show us this, I don't know what has in a very glaring way. But the systematic racism and white supremacy that still exists that Dr. King fought, he's passed that mantle to each one of us now. And so we carry that legacy as we continue that fight in 2021, unfortunately. But the beauty is, one political correspondent said, there are no longer two parties. It's not Democrat and Republican, but it's insurrectionists versus constitutionalists. Well, for Black people, it is white supremacy and anti-white supremacy. Those are the two parties that right now we have to recognize. And if you are anti-white supremacy, then we have to gather and unite together, because we battle a very, and I thank God this is a church program, we're battling spirits and wickedness in high places. So it's not just spiritual, it's not just physical, but it's also spiritual. But what I like about what Dr. King shared is he was very practical as well as spiritual too. And when he talked about the economic empowerment that we need as a people because of the harms of what 400 years of chattel slavery did to us for generations, well, we just want a good business partner in America. And that's all we're saying. That's all Dr. King said when he gave the speech on Washington in 1963. He said, America's promissory note has come back marked insufficient funds. And in a sense, insufficient funds morally and ethically, but also economically, because generations of poverty have persisted in the Black community. And that's why we see some of the disparities we see. And I know we'll get to that. I've rambled enough. But again, it was ethical as well as economic, and we don't want to lose that point.
Right. Dr. Hampton, as you talk about this economic impact, I wonder if we might turn things to Tosseia Holmes, who I know has a lot of experience in that. And really the same question, what has Dr. King's legacy meant to you, and how is it translated into your work, especially in economic development?
Sure. Well, I think when you consider economic development, you can think of it in sort of two paths, not limited to two, but one being entrepreneurship and the opportunities and ability to earn money by becoming self-employed and building your own companies. And then I think the second channel is equal pay in the workplace. In 1964, we were fortunate enough to have Dr. King have led and been largely responsible for the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But when we think about where we are today, and even in 1964, it took over 300 years for us to get to that point, right? In the early to mid 1600s, when slaves were being brought in to sort of supplant the white indentured servants, we immediately recognized that a system was born, right? A system of the idea that perpetually free labor, and otherwise cheaper, more abundant workforce was necessary in order for the colony and the growth of the economic opportunities that spread between the North and the South. And so for 400 years, we have suffered from, quite bluntly, white families accumulating wealth at the direct expense of Black families. And so in 1964, the Civil Rights Act, for me, and even being someone who has, spent a lot of time in working on the administration side of nonprofits, which includes human resources, I think about the instances, the real life examples and situations that I've had to navigate through. And had it not been for, banning discrimination in the workforce, what would that outcome, what would that look like? And so, Dr. King, of course, was one of many, one of hundreds and thousands of those, and even those people today who still lead. And so when I think about Dr. King, I certainly am not humble enough to even in comparison, compare myself to Dr. King and, quite frankly, Dr. Hampton, and Derrin on this panel. So it's an honor to be amongst all of you. And so I wake up every day being Tosseia, who the Lord has called me to be. I don't think about necessarily, creating long-lasting impact for the recognition of, but because it's right. It's the right thing to do. And so I think that, Dr. Hampton made a really good point. Right now, you are either for or against racism. Simply put, there is no other way to think about this. And I think sometimes, even when we think that we are for, when we see allies who are asking, what is it that they can do? And then they show up, and for them, it's an opportunity to say that they did something. But if we are not changing the way we think when we are lying on the pillow, when we are sitting in the comforts of our own home, when we are continuing to be influenced by a media that has painted Black men as dangerous and, crime-ridden communities that are as a result of the economic depression and suppression that our people have faced for so many years, then we are, internally, we're missing an opportunity to really influence change. It has to start at home. It has to start with heads of households teaching children how to be anti-racist. I think that, DEI efforts are great, but they're simply not enough. And so I appreciate St. Luke's and their efforts to be very, very intentional about becoming anti-racist. It's not enough to no longer say that I am not a racist person, or I would never do that, or I told my friend that that was wrong. Absolutely not. Thank you, but it's insufficient. We need a little bit more. We need you to understand your biases. We all have them. We all have them, no matter what race you are. We have thoughts that our brains are automatically responding based on something that we've tucked away. And so when you think about the economic impacts of slavery and the economic impact of the Jim Crow phases, let's not forget that while we have certainly come a long way, the racial wealth gap divide in America is astronomical, and it continues to grow. I've been in a situation where an employer increased, salaries for minorities on staff because they wanted to do good. They wanted to increase and do their part. And within 2 weeks, all of those counterparts, white people, also received the same increase. So it's a little bit more than just handing out or, saying that, you want to do your part when your mindset says, wait, we have to be fair. It wasn't necessarily fair for those folks to receive because they're Black. Actually, the reality of it is, yes, it was, because we're already at a disadvantage. So to bring us to bring us whole are efforts that I think we need to continue. And not only by banning discrimination through, the Civil Rights Act, but we now have an opportunity to continue to understand the roots of racism and how it continues to create that wealth gap divide that so frequently bars and holds people back, Black African Americans in this country, from being able to achieve the same level of attainment as their white counterparts.
Thank you for that response. I'll pose the same question to you, Derrin.
Yeah, thank you. So very eloquently said. So Dr. King I think that he believed in a nation of freedom and justice for all, and he encouraged all citizens to live up to that purpose and potential of America. And he did so by applying the principles of nonviolence. And so MLK Day and his life is a way to honor Dr. King's life and teachings by engaging in community action. And this community action continues to solve societal problems and build a beloved community. And so we know that from Dr. King's life, that service breaks down barriers by bringing people from different experiences together. And we know that volunteering can unite Americans of all ages and backgrounds while building stronger communities. Excuse me, I have a stuttering problem, and so I want to make sure that no one's put off by that. All right, but while we enjoy this long weekend of social media feeds full of inspirational quotes, I mean, it's not a holiday that we all enjoy equally. And it can be troubling for many Black Americans and many people in the Black community, myself included, to watch the nation celebrate Dr. King as a Black history icon. Dr. King is a national hero, yes, but if we closely examine his life was not about himself. He would not want us to held him in such high esteem. And don't be discouraged about that statement, because in my humble opinion, I think that he would want us to focus on each other. And I just mean that to focus so much on King's life is to critically underestimate the gravity of his life and death, and to rewrite history to rewrite his story as a simple one-dimensional narrative, like Dr. Hampton had alluded to earlier. Like his story, his life is so whitewashed that we underestimate that he is just a human. He was just a man who wanted to be good and do right for others. He wanted to right the wrongs that were prevalent in America. And that was the evils of racism, poverty, and war. And so that is to say that to place Dr. King on a pedestal for a single day is to overlook the complexity of the civil rights movement and to casually dismiss our own role in his legacy. But Dr. King lived his life and challenged us to be people who stood in the gap for others who did not have a voice. And so that's what I choose to do with my own life, and to lead an organization whose mission is to literally stand in the gap for vulnerable populations while empowering youth to actively transform their communities. So that's what I attribute his life into my own, to live out my work every single day.
Well, thank you so much for that reminder, Derrin, because I do think that in the glorious position that we have elevated Dr. King to, we do forget that his humanity and our humanity, in the sense that we too can create movements of change within our communities. And sometimes when we put people on pedestals, then we do discount ourselves. Oh, well, I'm no Dr. King. I'm no great speech giver or preacher or organizer. So then what can I do? Well, remembering his humanity then gives us, I think, the opportunity to dream with the kind of vision that he did. And I share that and underline that because I want those that are watching with us, our viewers, I want you to think about how Dr. King's legacy has impacted you. Have you been aware of the kind of full dimension of his work in the way that Dr. Hampton is calling us to remember? Have you read some of his works or listened to some of his speeches beyond the famous I Have a Dream speech? And read some of his other letters, like a letter from a Birmingham jail, or listened to his final address to people in Memphis. It's from there that you get that fuller, holistic picture of who he is. And so thank you for reminding us of that. I wonder if we might move to a different question, because I know that several years ago, when President Barack Obama was elected, a certain term, a buzzword, was all over our country, and that was post-racial America. And I don't know about you, but my newsfeed was flooded with pictures of Dr. King in the foreground and Barack Obama in the front, and people really thought, the dream has been fulfilled, because now we have an African American president. And what we heard from everyday people, as Derrin has reminded us to think about, is that racism and the barriers of racism were still showing up for them every single day. And this idea of post-racial America did not exist. And so we've heard about the incredible things that you're doing, the places of influence that you have, but I wonder if you might also share with our viewers how racism and the barriers of racism have shown up in your work. I want to start with Derrin this time. And I want you to know, Derrin, that here at St. Luke's, we are very affirming of anybody that has a stutter, because my husband has a stutter and preaches very often. And so we want you to feel comfortable sharing with us today. So I wonder if you might think about that.
Yeah, thank you so much for saying that and affirming that, because yeah, it is something that I've had to truly overcome over my life. But part of the ProAct story is my story. And had I not been put outside of my comfort zone to share my voice, I wouldn't have realized that I do not stutter if I speak in front of large groups of people. So thank you. Yeah,
no problem.
I realized that I didn't make my mouth, so I'd have to be obedient.
Well, I wonder what your thoughts are on that question of how racism shows up in your work as well.
Yeah, so ProAct's work and my work really overlaps mostly in education. And so we see that college degrees, or I think the common belief and myth is that college degrees are regarded as a primary vehicle for reducing poverty and closing the wealth gaps between people of color and people who consider themselves to be white. And so, but the disparities that exist are so alarming. So we see that Black students are less likely than white students to have a college-ready courses in high school and secondary education. In fact, recent studies have shown that only 57% of Black students have access to a full range of math and science courses necessary for college readiness, compared to 81% of Asian American students and 71% of white Americans and white students. And so we also see that even Black students who do have access to honors and advanced placement courses, they are vastly underrepresented in those courses. And Black and Latino students also represent 38% of students in schools that offer AP courses. And so they also have less access to gifted and talented education programs than white students. So Black students, we also see, there's so much data on this, that they also are located in schools with less qualified teachers with lower salaries, and novice or new teachers. And these teachers grossly, it's really troubling to see that the teachers don't look like the Black students, right, that are teaching them. So there's a clear lack of Black representation in school personnel. And I think the last stat I saw was that only 10% of public school principals were Black, and that's compared to 80% white. And 82% of public school educators are white, and that's compared to 18% of teachers of color. And so we see all kinds of disparities that overlap in the lives of people of color versus people who consider themselves white in education. And my job is to help people see these disparities and to do something about them. To step up, call them out, hold people accountable, and those people that are making those decisions to hire these educators and to training them, and then also making sure that they are equipped to build their capacity for professional and leadership development, especially because there's so many school personnel that aren't Black or represent the population of the schools that we serve. We have to educate teachers who are white on understanding the plight and the backgrounds of our students of color. So that takes some hard conversations, right? And it takes us coming to the end of ourselves to realize, hey, maybe we don't have it all together. Hey, maybe the problem is me. I think when there's any pushback against forward progress, we are really not really understanding who people are and where they come from. And
Mhm.
someone has to step up and say, hey, as far as I'm concerned, the problem is me. And so I
Mhm.
think that we all need to challenge ourselves with that question, is that,
Yeah.
hey, if we are seeing any conflict, any pushback on forward progress, well, maybe the problem is me. And
Mhm.
when we have that type of mindset and step back and think in that way, what does that call us to do? It calls us to step in someone else's shoes to see, hey, what are they going through? What is the fact that they don't have food over the weekends or dinner at home at night and they're hungry, is that helping them not focus in school? It's
Right,
the fact
right.
that they are latchkey kids and coming home to no parents being at home, is that affecting their work at school? Is that affecting their relationships? We have to ask ourselves these questions instead of having this narrow view of hey, our kids should fit in this box
Right,
and that's how
right.
it should be. And so that's how it overlaps my work, and it touches every single part of the education system when we talk about racism in
Mhm.
education.
And I think that this is something for our viewers, especially that attend St. Luke's and are familiar with Washington Township. Something we shared at our winter summit just a few days back that many people don't know about the north side of Indy is that Washington Township schools, at least the elementary, middle school levels, are 70% students of color.
Wow.
Despite the fact that the community is a predominantly white, predominantly upper middle class community. And the high school has a totally different demographic, as more white residents then send their children to high school, but do not send them to the elementary and to the middle school levels. And so
Mm.
we had to ask ourselves, not only in some of the resourcing that we're doing with local schools, are we part of the problem? How can we be a part of the solution? Have we really learned about the demographics of who's in our school system? Because it may not be who we think. And so
Right.
thank you for calling us to continue to evaluate our strategies based on who is actually there, getting to know the people in the neighborhood. I want to turn
No
that same
problem. Thank you.
question to Tosseia and how racism has shown up in your work with nonprofit economic development.
Sure. Well, I think that when we think about racism and going back to economics in general, we recognize that, yes, education is incredibly important. So is owning real estate and building your net worth through assets that actually appreciate in value. But even with education, we recognize that still the disparities between white families and Black families continue continue to plague Black and Latino communities. In fact, a college educated white head of household has 3 times more wealth compared to a Black family with the same degree of educational attainment. On
Mm.
average, a Black head of household who earned a bachelor's degree holds substantially less wealth. A Black person with a bachelor's degree substantially worth less than a white family's whose head of household didn't even finish high school. Right? Those
Mm.
are dramatic disparities. And so, yes, every family, whether white or Black, positions themselves to earn more through education. But when we look at it from an economic standpoint, why is it that educated Black women are the lowest paid population when you compare the workforce? And so I think that it's truly an example. Not only do we need to address, the educational disparities, but when we think about these neighborhoods and economic development opportunities, more than likely you're going to have a food desert in an area that's predominantly Black or Latino. Why
Mm.
is that? For a variety of
Mhm.
reasons. Some because you have less ability to make money as a business owner. In many other cases, you just aren't necessarily concerned with being a resource for that community, and it doesn't work for you anymore. And so we see a lot of those things start to leave neighborhoods. Folks start to disinvest in those neighborhoods. And so for me, for a community development standpoint, we think about what does that do to the social capital for minorities when you can no longer trust the people in your community When I remember, as I shared on the anchor point, I was a teenage mom at the age of 17. Thank God for my network.
Mm-hmm.
Because I had someone that I could trust to care for my child while I finished high school, then continued to work before I went on to college. Thank God for my network. But unfortunately, that's not necessarily the case for many minorities, especially in inner city communities. The higher the rate of poverty, the lower the life expectancy. And so those are things that we consider when we look at this from a community development lens. What are truly the social determinants that impact one's life? And I think that there are many that are incredibly important. When we think about housing, we need safe housing. When we think about education, we need teachers that are well-trained, that are educated, that actually care, and that are invested, that have a vested interest, if you will, in these children. And so for us, we look at, factors like, I think about Butler Tarkington area compared to the south side of 38th Street. There's almost a decade difference in the lifespan, where those who live north of 38th Street will outlive those who literally live, just a mile away by 10 years. Our people are dying because of poverty. We are dying because of the stressors that working in the workplace that is filled with underlying systems that are designed to continue to suppress us economically, mentally. That's challenging. I read an article that compared to PTSD to someone who has been in a war zone. And so we appreciate our allies, and we certainly think that, Dr. King's legacy is something to model. And we have a lot of work to do. A lot of folks may not necessarily, we hear it all the time about these disparities. We hear the catch phrase, white supremacy, white privilege, the Karens of the world, but those are real life, but that's real. It's not a social media hashtag for us. It's real life. I've left scenarios where I could no longer stomach the physical, the manifesting of stress, where I had to walk away from certain situations, and by people that didn't necessarily know that they were, influencing and having direct impact on my well-being. We are hurting as a people. So, because again, as Dr. Hampton mentioned earlier, thank God this is St. Luke's Church, because if you really truly care about mankind, if we're really here to be Christians, we cannot continue to overlook the fact that no matter where you turn, there is a moment where racism has either influenced your ability to get up and wake up in a safe household, to drive a car that you're not worried about whether or not it's going to make it, whether because it's going to break down or quite frankly, you have enough, gas to make it. Families really, really experience that on a daily basis. And it's not because we're not educated. It's not because we don't want to work. In fact, an unemployed head of household in a white family is still worth more than a working class Black family. This is reality. And so when we think about how do we overcome, how do we, continue to do our part, again, it starts with understanding our own bias, our own ways of thinking, and then really, really, truly beginning to immerse ourselves in being very intentional about unraveling that. Every single time you have a thought about a minority, you've interacted with one, or you've mistakenly assumed the worst, check yourself, begin to retrain your thinking, and then think about, is something that's been impressed upon me, or has that been my reality? Right. And so the next step for me is, as we work on the individual and as we work on the household, don't believe that you don't have within your power, within your reach, to have an influence. Go to your community neighborhood centers, go to your CDCs, get involved at the PTA level, get involved with know your police officers. really, really hone in on your community. That is where the real change happens. If we can build our communities, build our school systems, unravel and begin to dismantle some of the ways of life that we've just, that we've adopted over many, many years, I think that we can then change cities. We can
Right.
then influence and change states and eventually begin to see, even more change, necessary change to truly dismantle racism in America. But it has to start with becoming anti-racist. It has to start with our own minds.
Yeah.
And so, we see this all the time throughout education, economics, housing, lending, it's deeply rooted. And so I think that recognizing that, owning that, and preparing to, institute change in your own lives is key to dismantling racism.
Yeah. You use the term reality check. And I think that I invite those that are listening. Often we think about the barriers of racism as experienced by the targets of racism. But allies experience the barriers of racism, not personally, but in witnessing them. And I invite St. Luke's is a predominantly white congregation that is committed to becoming anti-racist. And one of the things that I think has been really transformative is as we have begun training people in what it means to be anti-racist, people have not only realized the ways in which they have seen racism happening around them and not been able to name it previously. And in not being able to name it, they're not in a position to dismantle it. So thank you for reminding us that reality check, that we not only need to call out racism as people of color, but as allies of people of color in the work of becoming anti-racist. And here at St. Luke's, that commitment to anti-racism is not really a commitment from a social perspective, but a biblical perspective. We say that we are following Jesus into being justice seeking. And so I wonder if Dr. Hampton, since you have one foot kind of in the pulpit, another foot in politics, if you might also answer that question about how racism and the barriers of racism show up in your work in that intersected place that you find yourself in leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. And first of all, Derrin and Tosseia were very eloquent. And I do want to share some systematic thoughts along those same lines, but let me first share from a personal perspective. My wife and I have a 15-year-old son, and one thing we will not allow him to do, unfortunately, he can't, and he asks to do it all the time. He can't jog around the block. He can't go to the mall with his friends. He can't do certain things that a normal teenager should be able to do, because I don't want him, if he's away from me, being stopped by police, and they may not know who I am or know who his daddy is in that moment. I don't want him to be profiled and to become another hashtag. And I hate that that's a reality, but that is my reality as a Black father. I'm afraid for my son.
Yeah.
And sad reality that we face in America. The mayor and I have had this conversation before, and he said it so eloquently in some of his public speeches, but he's never concerned that his son may be hurt or injured even if his son were to be pulled over by police. He said that's never even had to cross his mind. And so for those listening, it's a reality that we live on a daily basis. And systemically, economically, Tosseia has said it, educationally, Derrin has said it. And I guess I want to add to that systematic piece is there are three cycles: poverty, incarceration, and recidivism. When you think about how Black skin is often criminalized in America, right? Black is often criminalized. We have colorized and we have painted what is criminal Black. It must be wrong if it's Black. That group of Black kids must be up to something because they're Black. If, two Blacks are driving in a nice car, they must be pulled over. Why? Because they're Black. That's called profiling, but it's real because in the criminal justice system, and this statistic is in my head, so forgive me if I get it wrong, but the white population is comprised of 64% adults in America, but whites comprise 30% of the prison population. Black people comprise 12% of the US population, but 33% of the prison population. So mass incarceration is a major issue.
Time, Dr. Hampton.
Mass incarceration is a major issue. And the 13th Amendment, for those watching, please watch it if you haven't seen it. But Ava DuVernay did a great job in her directorial execution of this show, but let me just read the 13th Amendment very quickly. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. So the 13th Amendment is a constitutional loophole that allows for mass incarceration. And as Michelle Alexander says, it's the new Jim Crow. It's the 21st century slavery, mass incarceration. We already know that there are drug laws that have been applied disproportionately. We all know the statistics. White people do the most amount of drugs and they sell the most amount of drugs. But it's Black people who are overwhelmingly and predominantly the ones who are incarcerated for doing both. And so I could go on and on and on about the issues within the criminal justice system. What we've done here in the city of Indianapolis, I'm glad to have been a part of it. Mayor Hogsett's initiative, even from the time he was campaigning, was criminal justice reform. Now, he would tell you, and everybody could tell you, by no means are we where we need to be, but at least the steps are being made to cease from incarcerating individuals who really need either treatment for mental illness or drug addiction. Because here's another thing that happens that is a disparity. When white individuals are addicted to drugs or found to be addicted when they are arrested, they receive treatment. When Black people are found to be with drugs or addicted, they are incarcerated. There's a disparity. That's a race-based criminality, and it has to stop. So anything related to criminal justice reform, is something that I have a passion for. But as Tosseia mentioned, there is a cycle of poverty. And so if we are assaulting poverty, and when I say we, the United States government through policing, it almost punishes those who are simply impoverished. And especially it punishes those who are mentally ill or are dealing with addiction. Because what we need is treatment, or what we need are groceries, what we need is a break, what we need are economic opportunities. We don't need to be incarcerated, which will further perpetuate poverty.
Right.
And, one day America will get it right, and they'll listen to the Derrins of the world who are saying, if we educate our kids, look, you're either going to pay on the front end or the back end. So let's educate our children without these disparities. They'll listen to Tosseia and say, let's stop redlining and let's stop gentrifying our neighborhoods, further driving the Black population into poverty. It's a vicious cycle, and somebody benefits from it. So this is such an important conversation because, and I think you said it, Nicole, if we're serious, at least with our allies, about eradicating or at least being anti-white supremacy or anti-racist, what does that really, really mean? And I do understand what that really means at the end of the day is economically, something is going to have to be sacrificed to make this right.
Right.
Whether you call it reparations, whether you call it restitution, whether you call it reconciliation in spiritual terms, whatever it takes, at the end of the day, slaves have to be paid for 400 years of free labor that contributed to the wealth and the power and the accelerated success of America. And we have to look at that. It's the sin and the black eye of America that we have yet to repent from. And January 6th, we saw the strength of that opposition, the opposition to that. I get it. Somebody's gonna have to give something up. And those who, mistakenly think that by manifest destiny, that God has given them the right to, to subdue the world like that. That's a false narrative and a false theology that has been preached even from the pulpits, that God has ordained white supremacy and that everyone else should be subordinate and really live under that false ordained manifestation. That's not the case. It's time that we make right what has been wrong for so many years.
Well, you talk
And
about
it's a powder cave.
yeah, you talk about false narratives, and I'm so appreciative of this conversation because our hope in convening this group is that people would see perspectives from different sectors, from politics, economics, education, and that's what you all have been bringing to this conversation. And you talked about false narratives, Dr. Hampton, and I want to pose a question to Derrin on this because I've heard this narrative that we don't really need to do a lot of anti-racism training with youth because all of the people that need the training are older and the people that have more inclusive ideas are younger. And I wonder if you could speak to that based on your direct work with young people. Would you agree with that notion, or would you tell us a different narrative?
First, no, I don't agree with that notion. I think our youth think everyone needs to understand that from the moment that we are born, we are socially conditioned to be a certain way, to think a certain way, and to look a certain way, right? The moment you come out the womb, oh, we see something there, so it's a boy, right? Let's throw a blue onesie on him, right? And right, and we see when we talk about racism, there's so many things that influence our racism and perceived notions of people who look darker, right? Who are darker skin color. And so for those who still think that racism is not as prevalent today as it once was, we have to look at racism not as a single event or a person, but as a system. And I think we don't talk about that enough. I think many white Americans and people who look at themselves and think that they are white, they think that racism looks like that bigoted person that wears a white hood and is screaming out expletives on behalf to really demean Black Americans. That's not really what racism is. That's a byproduct, right? Racism is a system. And so we have to get on the same page about our definitions and terms first, so that we are speaking the same language, looking through the same lens, and rallying around the same cause with little misunderstandings. So if we unpack that a bit more, Nicole, many race scholars use the term white supremacy to describe a social, political, economic system of domination based on racial categories that benefit those who perceive themselves as white. And this system of structural power, it centralizes and elevates white people as a group. And there's a great book out, I'm sure you all know about it, at St. Luke's. It's called White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. And she states, I think I have one of the stats here, like in her book, she calls out all the systems that are dominated by white people. And so if we look at the breakdown of all these institutions, the 10 richest Americans are 100% white, 7 of whom are among the 10 richest in the world. U.S. Congress is 90% white from 2016 and 17, these stats. So U.S. Congress is 90% white, which is lower now after the most recent election. The top 10 military advisors, 100% white. The president and vice president, as we sit here today, is 100% white, and that will change here soon. The U.S. Freedom Caucus is 99% white. Those who decide our TV shows, 93% white. And 90% white control the books we read. 85% control the news that's covered. And 95% of white people decide which music is produced. And Robert DiAngelo says that people who directed the 100 top grossing films of all time worldwide is 95% white. And teachers, as I mentioned earlier, is 80% white. And the owners of men's professional football teams is 97% white. So these numbers are not describing like minor organizations. These are institutions that aren't a part of special interest groups. These are groups listed are some of the most powerful in the country, in the world even. And these numbers are not a matter of good people versus bad people. They represent power and control by a racial group that is in a position to disseminate and protect its own self-image, worldview, and interest across the entire society. And so when we have this notion and the narrative of racism is gone and the younger generation is more open, yes, by and large, the younger generation is more open. But that if we say that blanket statement, we are discounting the prevalence and the power and the system of control that racism is perpetuated by. And so how do we learn these biases and stereotypes? From our movies, the news, the books we read, the shows we watch, the representation that we see in our criminal justice system. Like all these systems that we navigate in and live in day in and day out is dominated by white culture. And so our youth, by and large, are affected by that because they learn these biases not only from all of our media sources, our criminal justice system, the books, school, even our education system. They learn from whom? Their parents, their previous generation. And so we can't discount those learned experiences that our youth are journeying in as they navigate the systems and the world around them, because they are just as affected by racism as we are. And they understand that.
Well, thank you for clarifying that. That's a much more articulate response than I would have given. But I think it's so important because that narrative, I mean, Dr. Hampton talked about false narratives. That narrative is very prevalent. And then what happens then is that we don't invest in resourcing and development and training and conversations that help to equip this next generation that is in a position to change some of those overarching statistics that you've talked about that really are culture shaping. So we've kind of walked through what the impact of King's legacy has had on you all as leaders, on the ways in which racism shows up in your own work. And now I want to turn us to strategy. Proven strategies that you've seen within your area of leadership that dismantle these barriers and create more equitable outcomes. And I want to start this time with Dr. Hampton. I know that some of you all are listening to this maybe while you are corralling kids that are home today because it's Martin Luther King Day. You're balancing working from home, but this is where I want you to turn the volume up as we listen to these dream keepers share these proven strategies. So we'll start with you, Dr. Hampton.
Sure. I think I'll start where I left off in the area of criminal justice reform. We began to realize that we cannot solve an issue by incarcerating individuals who either need treatment or need, just have basic needs. And so what Mayor Hogsett did through criminal justice reform was individuals who are arrested and if they're found to be drug addicted or if they are tested and diagnosed with a mental illness, they are not incarcerated, they go to treatment. And we know that those numbers were predominantly Black and brown individuals and citizens. And so that really helps to sort of act as a buffer, as you will, or rerouting individuals as a means of an alternative, to incarceration. And also with that, the high numbers of individuals who are dealing with mental illness, there has been reform around providing wraparound services, for example. And, one of the things we also found was, and this is in keeping with Tosseia's point with economics, we found some major disparities around minority companies or corporations receiving contracts. And so we did a disparity study, found where the disparities are, and reform some of the contractual language around city contracts. So, for example, and Derrin was very eloquent in stating the high percentages of those who really run everything are white. And so if, let's say we have new construction happening in the city, who's going to get that multi-million-dollar contract? Usually the prime contract awardee is going to be a white company, a large white company. And then they may, in keeping with compliance, right, with the minority business contract, they have to say, okay, we'll give a certain amount of business to a minority company, but as a subprime contractor. What we want to do is, and that's great, but what we want to do is move toward more minority-owned companies, whether it's a woman-owned business, Black or brown, whether it's LGBT, whether it's a veteran or a disability. We want to make sure that they are prime and not just subprime. That's a major area that, again, as we talk about wealth building, a few shouldn't just enjoy wealth. And I'm a firm believer that when we talk about poverty, it's not that we have a lack of resources, but we have an unequal distribution of those resources that's concentrated in a very small percentage of the hands. And so we just want to, let's spread the love.
Gotcha. Spread the love. Well, we're going to spread the question Tosseia's way. If you could share some proven strategies that have broken those barriers of racism and increased equity in your work.
Sure. Well, not to harp on the Civil Rights Act, but that certainly influenced a lot of where we are today when we think about the economic mobility of Black Americans. I think that, the U.S. must endure immense social transformation, led by adoption of courageous and very audacious national policies. I think, again, we think globally, but we need to act locally. We need programs that are centered in the hearts of majority minority neighborhoods like Indy's Northwest Side. The incubator that we recently launched, to tie back to Pastor Hampton's point, we want to build businesses and really give them the wherewithal and know-how to become successful entrepreneurs, so that when there is an opportunity to bid as a prime contractor, that they are sort of suited and booted, that they have the financing, that they have the equipment, that they have the staff infrastructure. And so one way that we are sort of looking to build out an even deeper strategy from an economic development standpoint is not only by building the incubator to teach those how to become not only effective business owners and leaders, but to also then open up those shops within the neighborhoods that we're talking about, within their own neighborhoods, their own communities. When we think about the racial wealth gap divide from an economic standpoint, it's estimated that the suppression of the Black buying power is about 5% our GDP. Now, that's about $1 trillion. So not only is it beneficial for Black people to earn more and to be able for us as Americans to work alongside each other with intentionality to close this gap, it helps to position this entire country in a better position economically. $2 trillion is huge. And that is just from a Black buying power standpoint. What if we think about the other communities, such as the brown community, that is also experiencing some of those same disparities, what that could look like, what we could look like as a nation, and then comparing that, globally. And so not only is the incubator an opportunity for us to truly help build up businesses, I mentioned the anchor point on Sunday that a part of the reason why this incubator is so important is not only because we want to teach folks how to build out a comprehensive business plan, but we're also connecting them with others, congregants from St. Luke's, for example, who didn't necessarily grow up with the same challenges and disparities or through the same neighborhoods or through, limited educational resources. Now it's an opportunity for us to really create some linkage between those two communities. It's an opportunity for us to create linkage to our ancestors that, as a result of slavery, the original inventors, the original mathematicians, the originals, in Africa, who and we have that pedigree, that linkage needs to be restored. And entrepreneurship is not new to Black people, but it may not be something that we could pass down generation over generation over these last 400 years. We just need to reconnect to who we are. So when you feel the sense that, your heart is pulling you in a different direction and you want to become an entrepreneur, we believe that by creating a place for those people to come and bring their ideas, we can then facilitate and help them to rebuild their communities, to rebuild their families, to increase their economic mobility by building self-employment, by building out your own business. The second thing is, we are working, the CDC is working to build an association of local employers who are all committed to achieving inclusion and equal pay through, Crooked Creek CDC working with the largest concentration of jobs in the city, Park 100. So when we think about the opportunity to connect, what we have identified as some of our needs, we certainly know that, yes, we can connect folks with good paying jobs, with better paying jobs, but it's also about fostering an environment that really, truly focuses on inclusion.
Right.
That is committed to sending their employees and their managerial staff through DEI workshops and webinars, employers that are dedicated and committed to reviewing their policies to see if there is something that, implicitly discriminates against, someone potentially in the workforce. For example, Skillful Indiana is a really, really good program. They are working with employers and neighborhood organizations to reach out to employers to review their job descriptions. One way that we sometimes discriminate is by, having requirements that don't necessarily align to or aren't necessary to be successful in that role. So let's remove some of those barriers. And the CDC is working to facilitate those conversations, to bring in, our constituents and representatives from our neighborhoods to really meet with business owners where they are and to be transparent in, we have some work to do. So I think that, again, not to be repetitive, it starts with us as individuals and then within our families, within our communities, within the businesses that we run, the businesses that we manage, and then everything that, it is really truly about assessing what is reality from what has been impressed upon us. And then it's also, not ignoring when you hear your colleagues cry out for help. And even if it's not necessarily in such an elaborate term as I just poorly used, but when you feel these stressors after a George Floyd incident, create an environment that can foster, some sort of relief to that person, no matter what that may look like, and I'm not challenging employers to bring in therapists, but if your policies and procedures are written from the perspective of inclusion, and that is not just bringing in and increasing your diversity numbers, right? It's much, much deeper than that. We have to truly evaluate, if there is a way, we often, again, just from managing payroll for many years, and actually being a consultant for a lot of different businesses, we sometimes, even as employers, don't even fill out the DEI information in the system. It's not required. Well, why is that? Everything else, that every other box we fill out, we have to check which box we belong, right? Am I a Black person? Am I single? Am I married? But when we go to work, employers are not forced to necessarily retain or maintain. So when we think about legislation, there are necessary improvements when we think about how we operate in the workforce. And then, of course, from an entrepreneur standpoint, I do think that it's a lot easier today than it was, 30, 40 years ago for a Black person to go and get a loan. Absolutely. But we also cannot forget that not only, did we once have thriving communities, not just Tulsa and Black Wall Street, but those communities were all over the country. I know that we give a lot of recognition to that one, but please trust and believe that was not the only group of Black folk that were doing well, right? And then you had very, intentional disruption of that again. The moment that we began to prosper, and the moment, in the 1940s, when you saw that Black people were doing well, we were hunted down and killed for our ability to build up our communities.
Yeah.
That is not something that is so far-fetched. My grandmother was born in 36, right? She is the living witness. Now imagine how she has passed down her experiences through her family, the same way that racism is also passed down through other families. So yes, it's important to address it, at the childhood level. It's important to begin to infiltrate and pull apart what has been so meticulously woven through the eyes of white supremacy. And so when we think about how do we overcome this, I think that no solution is too small. Us having a conversation with an employer that says, hey, when was the last time you reviewed and compared how much your minority employees are being paid in comparison to their counterparts? When was the last time you reviewed your job description to determine if that role, to be successful, it was really necessary to have all of these accolades? And start to have those conversations. And one by one, this was not built overnight. And I think that even though we quickly established, superiority, if you will, and wealth was began to accumulate for white families on the backs of Black families 400 years ago, we cannot offer one solution that is going to solve all of this. It is not a phase for us. This uproar, and while we love social media and what it has done for, community policing in a way, even, and then being able to document some of these stories that we see, a Black boy being tackled in a hotel accused of stealing an iPhone, right? All of those examples, while they are true, we experience these things on a daily basis as parents. Dr. Hampton mentioned that his son can't go to the mall. I'll be honest, my son goes, and the only worry that I have is that he will somehow be bothered by the police, or, I dropped him off. Let's not go in Von Maur. How about I drop you off at the food court? I, as a parent, shouldn't have to think of those things. I, as a parent, should then have to go to work and also think of
Right. And Tosseia, your sharing reminds me even of a sermon I preached at St. Luke's this summer during our Just Us or Justice series. And one of the stories I shared, our family built a home in Noblesville, and our first month, we had one of our new neighbors, a little girl, call my daughter the N-word. And people were in shock that this was happening in 2020. And what you're reminding us is that these things happen all of the time, but they don't just happen individually, they happen systemically. And I love that idea that no solution is too small. And so I really want to remind our viewers about some of the solutions that we are working towards here at St. Luke's, and Tosseia is a part of that with the Minority Business Incubator. And you'll see a link in the chat to learn more about how you can get involved in that. But I also want to turn to what some of the solutions may be in the educational sector. And Derrin, if you we're getting close to our time, might briefly share kind of some of the proven strategies that you have implemented at ProAct.
Sure. So I always step back and look at what the problem is. And so our mission is to stand in the gap for vulnerable populations while empowering youth to actively transform their communities. And when I talk about standing in the gap, I'm referring to the faith-based analogy of a protective wall around the city. If the wall is broken in a certain place, that is a gap in the wall. That's brokenness. And we all know that gaps are not good, that they open up cities to potential threats that can damage the city and its people for generations. So some cities might try to hide the gap by denying that there is one. Yet others might try to whitewash and plaster simply to hide the gaps, the missing bricks and the weak spots in the wall. And so when we cover them, we don't notice, right? It's just a Band-Aid. So this leaves vulnerable people in danger, but makes them feel safe, secure, and confident. And so how many times have we seen organizations, schools, churches, and businesses, and so forth, try to hide or mask problems within their approach to how they serve? Don't really answer that, but think about that. We see all these organizations doing work, and then from my lens, when we talk about, I look through a lens of community engagement or community service. If the wall that we are talking about has gaps in it. If that wall is current strategies in community engagement and solving societal problems, then the gap demonstrates how many organizations, these schools, these churches, these nonprofits and businesses are siloed. And we oftentimes don't sustainably support each other in work that oftentimes overlaps to support vulnerable populations. So what ProAct does in our strategy, and speaking from what I know, is that we have seen that we tend to invest in programs and services that offer interventions rather than preventative and proactive approaches to break down silos that create gaps in people's lives. So to stand in the gap, I'm encouraging that we fight to protect our city's most vulnerable populations by connecting those with resources to those who lack resources. And the way that we do this is that we want to connect those people from middle to high income economic statuses to people in poverty, and people that are adversely affected by racism are in poverty, right? And so we want to connect these schools, businesses, and nonprofits in a very intentional way by facilitating their community engagement and volunteer engagement programs. So businesses would invest in ProAct not only to get their employees engaged in the community, but to help their employees feel more connected to their job and work. Nonprofits would invest in ProAct to get their volunteers to be more engaged in not only their work, but the work for the vulnerable populations that they serve. And that engagement helps support our youth and keeps our youth engaged in our programs free of charge to their families. And so simply, if you look through a lens of community engagement, we need to really break down these silos and be open and honest about, hey, maybe we don't have all the answers. Maybe my way is not the best way. We need to find shared value approaches that really creates co-opetition, which is it's a word coined in a book. Co-opetition means that we can't compete in business and for grants. We can't compete, but we can always find ways to work together in ways that will benefit not only us, but the communities that we serve. And so we call our model, in our approach, a proactive community, which is one business, 3 to 5 schools, and 5 to 7 nonprofits who are all working together intentionally to break down silos, to help our youth have a supportive ecosystem so that they can thrive. And so that helps support the educators in schools, it helps the families, and it helps provide shared value amongst everyone involved, because we facilitate, monitor, and support all the engagement between our partners. And so we've seen great success with that. And we've also found that it's not enough to just engage people, right? What people don't see about ProAct is that we do 4 times as many trainings as we do service projects, because we firmly believe that you can't effectively truly serve vulnerable populations and people adversely affected by racism and poverty if you don't understand the social context that they live in. Right. I can't serve you, David, if I don't understand racism, if I don't understand poverty, if I don't understand sexism. And so we train on those concepts before we even get into the community engagement piece, because we have to understand people, we have to see people and meet them where they are. And we have to redefine what it means to serve, from being less about the act of service and more about the intentionality of building relationships, which means we have to connect people to people and help people see people as people and not as objects.
Right. You're reminding me of a sermon that was preached yesterday here at St. Luke's, and that really was unpacking the way that God responds to justice, and reframing even our justice conversation is not a question of who do I think my neighbor is or who do I think that I am, but who do I think that God is? And really walking us through some of what you shared, that God sees, hears, and does. That's God's framing of responding to justice. And as followers of a justice-seeking God, we're called to do the same. And I love hearing the intentional resourcing that you give people, giving them the opportunity to see and hear from people they'll be in a service relationship with before we just rush and do, because we can do great harm without taking the time to listen and hear from one another. And that's really what we've been doing here today, listening and hearing from thought leaders that can help us continue this work. As we prepare to close our conversation, I want to pose one more question to you. And to frame it, I want to read one of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s quotes that says this: "We have come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy." I don't know about you, but that quote seems more salient today than when it was said several decades ago. As we close our conversation, I would love for each of you to respond to this question: what does every single viewer need to do right now to build a more just community from the vantage point of your leadership, whether that's education, economic development, or from political engagement? What do people need to do right now, as Dr. King calls us to? I'm going to start with Dr. Hampton.
Things Dr. King said was that anyone can be great because anyone can serve. And so wherever we can find a place to serve, the urgency is now. I do believe that we're at high time, to create change. So involved in your community, sometimes that comes by way of knowing who your elected officials are. Call them if you have any questions, hold them accountable, attend committee hearings and meetings, attend city council meetings. They happen on every week. You can watch Channel 16. Also, in closing, Chief Economist Catherine Mann said, and she was just talking about how banks have contributed to, and many of our corporations here in Indy have contributed to a racial equity fund and financing communities. Chase Bank has given, I think, $30 billion pledge, and then Citibank maybe a $1 billion pledge to invest into Black communities. But one of the things that Karen Mann said was that the failure to support minority communities has cost the U.S. economy $16 trillion in lost output. So that should tell us all that is a detriment to all of us. We would all do better. High tides rise all ships, right? So when we invest into communities, it really helps with greater output for the income of the nation. We're suppressing people and we're suppressing economic opportunity for all of us. And so I would say, let's be cognizant of that. And if you're in any position to give back to the Black community, do so because it benefits all of us.
Thank you, Dr. Hampton, for that response. Let's turn to Tosseia. What do people need to do right now?
Well, I think that Dr. Hampton is right. Support Black business. And that's not just, purchasing one time. It is supporting them through their growth. It's supporting them through their ups and downs. And it's truly making a commitment to help them sustain what they are trying to do, not only for themselves, for their families, but also for their communities as well. I think that, if you are in a position to hire, any person for any role, take a self-assessment to understand, are you unintentionally, explicitly, or implicitly introducing bias into your decision-making process? Sometimes you will meet the right person who may not have, the right package or the, right opportunities to have groomed them for the perfect interview, right? But they have the tenacity, they have the skill set, they have the mindset and the commitment to do well in those roles. And so I think that sometimes it's going to be about taking a chance, right? A little bit of this is us all understanding where we are today and trying to navigate where we want to be in the future. There is no recipe. We don't know, the perfect ingredients that must come together at the perfect time. But I do think that, again, if we begin to focus on ourselves and what we think about other communities, one way easily to help overcome and to grow is by immersing yourselves in other countries. And so I think that if there is a fair, a community opportunity or event for you to get engaged in, join it. If there is an opportunity for you to, as Pastor Hampton mentioned, be a voice, come to those hearings. The CDCs are pretty much located throughout the city. And so no matter where you live, where you are listening, there is an opportunity for you to truly engage in your community every single day. And I think that today is a perfect time to do that. Of course, if you are a member at St. Luke's, we appreciate their partnership with the Minority Business Incubator. We've had a surge of those interested as we begin to promote and tell more about that. We've had a surge of people who are interested in saying, I'm a former banker. How can I help? Well, let's lean to your networks. Let's lean on your experience of what it takes to present the right proposal to, the bank so that we can fund minority business efforts. And so I think that there are a plethora of ways for folks to get involved, but specifically from an economic standpoint, we have to recognize that we are at a disadvantage as African Americans living in America. And yes, you may not have contributed to that process, but you can certainly contribute to the dismantling of it. So get involved today and get involved locally.
Thank you. And finally to Derrin, what do you want people to do right now?
Yeah, I would challenge people to take a moment and think about what Dr. King and many of you do to stand in the gap for vulnerable people. And when you think of vulnerable people, you may think of your husband or wife who just lost their job, your son or daughter who has been thinking about taking his or her own life. It could be your brother, your sister, or a family member who you haven't spoken to in a year, who you haven't spoken to in years because they may drink a little bit too much. It could be your neighbor who you haven't spoken to because they parked their car backwards. Or it could be your coworker who fell through you under the bus in your last project together. Or a vulnerable person could be that man on the side of the street just standing out in the cold asking for a couple of dollars of food. So something in us always says to do something. Don't ignore that feeling. I think to ignore that feeling means that we are betraying ourselves and we're betraying what we are all called to do. So we stand in the gap by first seeking to understand before we are understood, as Nicole said earlier. And this requires some consideration, requires patience, requires courage. And if we seek to understand others and acknowledge the problems that they are facing, in doing so, we naturally communicate the love and grace that they so desperately need. And so I think that we must remember that people do not care how much we know, they just want to know how much we care. And we are called to be a light and not a judge, to help provide the light of understanding and direction while leaving judgment up to God. And we must take these steps and take them and be necessary and intentional, right, around understanding those around us so that we might do everything possible to win their hearts and build an intentional relationship. So in short, I think we must simply build trust by risking ourselves. When another person stands in the gap for us, we are filled with the courage and confidence to do the same for someone else. And so if you look at the full transcript of Dr. King's life, we are forced to recognize that he calls us to a love that is both compassionate and furious, right? He calls us to be compassionate toward the hurting and furious with the systems causing the hurt. And so one of my favorite quotes is that resistance, as Dr. King wrote, I think it was in one of his letters to Birmingham, is that resistance is the courageous confrontation of evil by the power of love. He calls us to a love that's both angry and active, a love that disrupts what is comfortable for what is right. And so I say, let's celebrate MLK Day together, but in doing so, let's honor Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. for the person that he was, not just for the quips that he inspires. Let's honor his full personhood by honoring the people it will cost us to honor, and being present and loving in the spaces in our communities where it's uncomfortable. And maybe not be satisfied until we are all free at last. And so my hope, Nicole, is that our listeners that once they leave here, that they'll be encouraged to find those vulnerable people around them and have the courage to stand in the gap for them by walking up to them and saying something as simple as, hey, it's good to see you, or I'm not giving up on you. And that's my call to action.
Yeah. Well, you talk about this love, and I know that everyone who has been in this conversation has experienced that in each of you, and the leadership and the impact that you are making in our communities. And we just want to say from St. Luke's that we love you, that we love what you're doing, and we love the opportunity to join alongside you in that work. So much so that we don't want this conversation to end without praying for you, praying for your continued leadership and impact in dismantling systems of racism, and in calling other people to join you in keeping this dream alive. To all of our viewers that have joined us, we are so grateful that you have been in the midst of this conversation. You'll find in the chat several links to the organizations that our Dream Keepers are connected to and are leading. And you'll also find some of the concrete ways that St. Luke's is, as Derrin is talking about, is seeing and hearing and responding to vulnerable people within our community. You heard about some of those this weekend as we are exploring launching a Freedom School, starting an after-school program, investing in our minority business incubator, convening the Roundtable, which is a diverse group of congregations, so that we can continue conversation, not just when social media hashtags show up, but rather to create real relationships so that when crises come, we are in a much better position to respond and to dismantle racism. So we hope that you will continue to convene and to invest and to be an ally and advocate in our community with us. Let's close in prayer together. Holy and awesome God, we celebrate the life and the legacy of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And we are grateful for his dream, but not just for his dream, but the source of his dream, your Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ, a God who spoke truth to power, who turned over systems of injustice right in the church and calls us to respond with the same compassion and the same conviction. God, I'm so grateful for these dream keepers who are keeping this dream alive in the area of economic development, educational resourcing, and in politics and faith. Oh God, continue to bless them, give them strength and endurance to keep running this race. But most of all, oh God, I'm praying for those who are watching. I pray that some hearts will be opened. Some ideas will be set free. Someone will attend a community meeting or join a board or start serving or begin a relationship with someone that is different from them. Oh God, make us all dream keepers, people who help to transform our community, people who see injustice and see, hear, and do something. For we are your disciples. We are your followers. Help us to be more like you. We pray all these things in the name of Jesus. And all God's people said, amen. Thank you so much for joining us for our first annual Dream Keepers panel. We hope that you will continue to work for justice. Have a wonderful rest of your day.